I have been doing this for a long time, and in that time, I have watched homeowners spend thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours, and a whole lot of frustration trying to get a beautiful yard. And almost every single time, the problem wasn't effort. It wasn't money. It was that nobody ever sat them down and told them the 8 things that actually matter. So that's what I'm going to do today. These are the only 8 landscaping tips you will ever need. And if you follow them, everything else starts to take care of itself. Design for how you live, not how it looks. I want to start here because this is the mistake I see more than any other. And it doesn't matter if someone is brand new to gardening or if they've been at it for 20 years. People walk outside, look at their yard, and the first thing they do is start thinking about what they want it to look like. They pull up photos on their phone. They walk through nurseries and fall in love with plants. They see something beautiful in a neighbor's yard and they want to copy it. And I completely understand that impulse. I'll be honest with you, I still have it myself. But here's the problem. When you design for appearance first, you end up with a landscape that looks pretty in a photo and doesn't actually work for the people who are supposed to be living in it. The right way to approach this, the way that landscape architects and experienced designers approach it, is to start with a list of questions. Not about plants, not about colors, about you. How are you going to use this space? Do you have kids or pets who need open areas to run around in? Do you want to grow food? Do you want a place to sit outside in the evening? Is there a view you want to frame or a neighbor's fence you want to block? Are you willing to maintain a lawn, or would you rather never touch a mower again in your life? You answer those questions first. And then, and only then, do you start thinking about plants and materials and design elements. I'll give you a real example of what I mean. A lot of people assume that a front yard needs a lawn. They think that's just what a front yard is. But if you're not running on it, if your kids aren't playing on it, if your dog isn't using it, if you're literally just walking through it to get to your front door, then that lawn is pure maintenance with zero payoff. And what could replace it? A courtyard, a garden of native plants that barely need water, raised beds with vegetables, a gravel garden with sculptural plants. The options are actually exciting once you stop assuming you need grass. Think of your yard as a series of spaces, not a single surface. Even a small yard can have a seating area, a planting area, maybe a little path connecting them. It doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. Simple is usually better. But those spaces need to be designed around how the people who live there are actually going to use them, not around how they might look in a photo. Get this part right, and everything that comes after it gets easier. Fix your soil. First, everything else is secondary. All right, I want to talk about something that most people find about as exciting as watching paint dry. Soil. And I know, it doesn't sound glamorous. But I am going to tell you something that I mean with complete sincerity after decades of doing this work. Nothing you do in your garden matters more than the health of your soil. Not the plants you pick, not the fertilizer you buy, not the irrigation system you install. None of it matters if the soil underneath is dead. And when I say dead, I mean it literally. Most residential soil, especially in newer neighborhoods where construction has compacted everything and stripped away the topsoil, is biologically empty. There's no beneficial bacteria. There's no beneficial fungi. There are no good nematodes, no protozoa, none of the living organisms that make soil actually function the way it's supposed to. And when your soil is biologically empty, your plants are essentially trying to grow in a parking lot with a thin layer of dirt on top. Here's what healthy soil does that dead soil cannot. Healthy soil breaks down organic matter naturally so you don't get that buildup of thatch in your lawn. It aerates itself through microbial activity and earthworm movement so your roots can actually penetrate deeply. It suppresses pests and diseases because the beneficial organisms outcompete the harmful ones. And it feeds your plants in a slow, steady, natural way that synthetic fertilizers simply cannot replicate. So how do you build it? A few ways. Compost is the classic answer, and it's still a great one. Earthworm castings are fantastic. Top-dressing mulch breaks down over time and feeds the soil from the top down. And there are concentrated biological products specifically formulated to introduce and stimulate beneficial life in the soil. We'll talk more about a couple of these in a few minutes. Here's the thing that trips a lot of people up. They think fertilizing and feeding the soil are the same thing. They are not. Fertilizer, particularly synthetic fertilizer, feeds the plant directly. It bypasses the soil entirely. And if you're only ever using synthetic fertilizer, you are feeding your plants but starving your soil. Over time, that soil gets more and more depleted. You need more and more fertilizer to get the same result. It's a cycle that works against you. The goal is to build a soil that is so alive and so active that it does most of the heavy lifting for you. And that is not a fantasy. It is entirely achievable in almost any yard. It just requires shifting your focus from what's growing above the ground to what's happening below it. Master watering. Less is almost. Always more. Here is something I've said probably 10,000 times in my career, and I will say it again. Nothing kills plants faster than too much water. Not drought. Not heat. Not pests. Overwatering. And yet it is still, to this day, the most common mistake I see in home gardens everywhere. I think the reason is emotional, honestly. You see a plant that looks stressed, and your instinct is to help it. And water feels like help. It feels nurturing. But there are so many situations where water is exactly the wrong response. Let me give you a perfect example. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's hot. You walk outside and your tomato plants are wilting. And your first thought is, they need water. But here is what's actually happening. The plant is hot. It is responding to excess heat by wilting, which is its way of reducing the surface area exposed to the sun. It is a survival mechanism, not a distress signal about water. If you water it now, you're combining heat with excess moisture. And that combination is actually more dangerous to the plant than the heat alone. So what do? You wait. You check the plant again in the morning. If it still looks wilted in the morning, before the heat of the day sets in, then yes, it needs water. But if it looks healthy and refreshed in the morning, then it was just hot. It didn't need anything from you except a little patience. The goal with watering, whether you're watering a lawn, a tree, a vegetable garden, or a flower bed, is to water deeply and as infrequently as possible. Deep watering encourages roots to grow down into the soil, where they have access to more moisture and more nutrients and more stability. Shallow, frequent watering keeps roots near the surface, where they're vulnerable to heat, drought, and disease. Now there are exceptions. When you've just planted seed, you water frequently and shallowly, 3 or 4 times a day, to keep that seed moist while the sun is out. Because it's that combination of warmth and moisture that makes seed germinate successfully. But once you have an established lawn or established plants, you switch to deep and infrequent. Timing matters too. The best time to water is just before, or just as the sun is coming up. You minimize evaporation loss. The water soaks in, and then the sun comes up and dries everything off. Watering late at night is a real problem if you have any fungal issues, because that water just sits there all night on wet leaves and wet soil, and fungal disease loves exactly that environment. And one more thing on this. If you have compacted or heavy clay soil, one of the best things you can do is apply a soil penetrant or a biological product once a month that actually helps break the soil down and make it more porous so that water can get in and move through instead of sitting on the surface and running off. It is a small habit that makes a genuinely dramatic difference. Choose the right plant for the right place. I want to say something that might step on a few toes, and I'm okay with that. The nursery is not a candy store, I know it feels like one. Everything is beautiful. Everything is in bloom. Everything is calling your name. I have been in this industry since 1980, and I still walk into a nursery sometimes and want to buy things I have absolutely no plan for. So I am not judging you. I am speaking from very personal experience here. But the single most common planting mistake I see, by far, is choosing a plant because it was pretty at the nursery, and then finding out 6 months or 2 years later that it's completely wrong for the space. It got too big. It needs more sun than you have. It needs more water than you want to give it. It's invasive, and now it's taking over. It drops so many leaves or seeds or berries that your yard is a constant mess. The right way to select plants is in response to your site analysis. You look at your space first. How much sun does it get? What's the soil like? How much water does it receive naturally? What's the climate? What's the scale? Because scale is a huge one that people consistently underestimate. Almost every normal-sized tree, meaning 25 feet tall and wide or bigger at maturity, is too large for a typical residential lot. And yet, I see them planted in small yards all the time. Chinese elms, camphor trees, large oaks. These are park trees. They are magnificent in the right setting. But in a small backyard or along a narrow driveway, they eventually become a problem that costs a lot of money to deal with. For smaller spaces, look at small patio-scale trees, eastern or western redbud, certain varieties of fruitless olive, small ornamental trees that top out at 15 feet or less. These are the right tools for most residential spaces. And then there is the native plant conversation, which is a little more nuanced than most people think. A lot of people hear native plants and think, great, I'll plant them and never think about them again. That is not quite right. Native plants often need just as much care as any other plant during the establishment period, which can be a year or two. The payoff comes after establishment, when they typically need far less water and far less maintenance than non-native plants. But you also have to be careful about which natives you choose, because even within a state, native plants can be very specific to particular conditions. A coast redwood, for example, which is our state tree in California, really wants summer fog. Plant it somewhere dry and hot, and it will not be happy. So do your research and select carefully. The right plant in the right place is a plant that will thrive with minimal intervention. And that's the goal. Mulch. Like your garden depends on it, because it does. I have a friend who has been gardening for 30 years and she called mulch boring. I almost didn't recover from that, because if there is one thing in this entire list that is genuinely underappreciated, that punches way above its weight class in terms of what it does for your garden, it is top-dressing mulch. And I want to try to change some minds here. Here is what a good layer of top-dressing mulch actually does. It protects your soil from the sun, which reduces evaporation and keeps the soil temperature more stable. It breaks down over time and adds organic matter to the soil, which feeds the beneficial life we talked about earlier. It suppresses weeds in a way that is incredibly effective and completely chemical-free. It keeps the soil moist between watering, which means you water less. And it makes your planting beds look clean and finished, which is just a nice bonus on top of everything else. The suppression of weeds alone is worth the effort. When you have a properly mulched bed, weed seeds can't get to the soil easily, and even the ones that do germinate struggle to establish through a good layer of mulch. Over time, as you keep refreshing your mulch every couple of years, you can get to a point where your beds are almost self-managing when it comes to weeds. Almost. I want to be careful not to promise miracles, but it is genuinely impressive what consistent mulching does over time. You want roughly 2 to 3 inches of mulch over your planting beds. Too little, and it doesn't do much. Too much, and you can create problems with moisture retention right against plant stems and trunks, which can lead to rot. So 2 to 3 inches, keep it away from the base of your plants and the trunks of your trees, and refresh it every couple of years as it breaks down. Wood-based mulches, composted bark, gorilla hair, that kind of material are great for most applications. They break down at a reasonable rate, and they look good doing it. This is not a glamorous tip. I know that. But it might be the highest return on investment of anything on this list in terms of labor saved, water saved, chemicals avoided, and long-term soil health gained. Do not skip it. Prune smart, not hard. Pruning is one of those things where a little knowledge goes a long way, and a lack of knowledge can do some real damage. And I mean that literally, because improper pruning can disfigure trees, introduce disease, create structural weakness, and turn a beautiful natural plant into something that looks like it lost a fight with a hedge trimmer. Let me talk about the single most common pruning mistake first, which is topping trees. Topping is when you cut the top off a tree to try to control its height. And I understand the logic. The tree is getting too big, so you cut it shorter. But here's what actually happens. The tree responds by sending out a flush of fast-growing, weak, upright shoots just below the cut. These shoots are structurally weak because they're not proper branches. They grow fast, and they grow upright, and within a season or two, the tree is basically back to the same height it was before, except now it's structurally compromised and looks terrible. Topping is not a solution. It is a problem disguised as a solution. The right approach is thinning cuts. A thinning cut removes a branch entirely, all the way back to where it originates, either at the trunk or at a larger branch. You are not cutting branches in half. You are removing them completely. This opens up the canopy, reduces weight, improves airflow, and keeps the tree looking natural. It does not stimulate that aggressive regrowth the way heading cuts do. There is also a technique called drop crotching, which is used when you do need to reduce the height or length of a branch. Instead of cutting it in the middle, you cut it back to a smaller side branch that can take over as the new leader. It keeps the tree looking natural and doesn't leave those ugly stubs that invite disease and decay. Timing is another thing worth understanding. If you want to slow a tree's growth, the smartest time to prune is right after it has put on its new growth for the year. Here's why. A tree puts on new growth specifically to fuel more growth through photosynthesis. If you prune right after that new growth appears, you remove the tree's capacity to photosynthesize as aggressively, and you slow its overall growth rate. It's a little bit like tricking the tree. And I find that more satisfying than it probably should. One more thing. You do not need to put anything on pruning cuts. No black pruning compound. No tar. No goop of any kind. A clean cut made with sharp tools heals beautifully on its own, out in the open air with good circulation. Those compounds crack over time and actually trap moisture and disease against the cut. The only exception is if you're pruning oaks or elms during the growing season, in which case a latex-based paint over the cuts helps prevent beetles from spreading diseases like oak wilt and Dutch elm disease. But that is a very specific and fairly rare situation. Clean cuts. Thinning, not heading. No compounds. That is the foundation of smart pruning. Control weeds by building a stronger landscape. A lot of homeowners spend a significant portion of their gardening time and energy fighting weeds. Pulling them, spraying them, cursing at them, pulling them again. And I understand why. Weeds are relentless and they are deeply annoying. But here's something that changed the way I think about weed control. And I think it might change the way you think about it too. Weeds are frequently a symptom, not the disease. When you have a healthy, dense, biologically active soil covered with a strong layer of mulch and filled with vigorous, well-established plants, weeds struggle. They can't get to the soil easily. They can't compete with established root systems. They can't find the light they need to establish when a strong canopy of plants is already shading the ground. Weeds thrive in disturbed, bare, weak, poorly managed spaces. So the best weed control strategy is not a spray bottle. It is a healthy landscape. Build your soil with beneficial life so it becomes dense and active. Plant at appropriate spacing so that your plants grow together and cover the ground. Use mulch consistently. Keep your lawn thick and healthy so there are literally no gaps for weed seeds to find purchase. A lawn that is managed properly, mowed at the right height, watered deeply, and fed with soil-building products is one of the best weed barriers you can have because there is simply no room for weeds to establish. Now, if you already have a weed problem, you are not going to solve it overnight by building healthy soil. You need a short-term strategy alongside the long-term one. There are some low-toxicity options that work well. Iron-based herbicides are one that I've been using recently that I think are genuinely interesting and effective. They work selectively on broadleaf weeds and they are far less problematic environmentally than traditional synthetic herbicides. But even as you use those short-term solutions, keep investing in the long-term health of your landscape. Because a landscape that is thriving doesn't give weeds much of a foothold. And eventually, if you stay consistent, you reach a point where weed management goes from a weekly battle to an occasional afternoon of light work. That is a realistic goal. I have seen it happen in many gardens over the years. Think long game, maintain less by planning. This last one is less of a technique and more of a mindset. And in some ways, I think it's the most important thing on this entire list, because it's the thing that ties all the others together. Beautiful, low-maintenance landscapes do not happen by accident. They are not the result of a weekend of enthusiastic planting and a trip to the garden center. They are the result of decisions made early in the process. Decisions about site analysis, about plant selection, about soil preparation, about drainage, about scale, about all the things we have talked about today. The irony of landscaping is that the more time you spend thinking and planning before you ever put a single plant in the ground, the less time you spend maintaining and fixing problems once those plants are in. Let me talk about drainage for a second, because it's something people almost never think about until water is coming into their house, or their yard turns into a small lake every time it rains. Good drainage is not glamorous. It is not the kind of thing anyone is excited to budget for. But getting it wrong is expensive and stressful in ways that are very hard to undo after the landscape is already established. Grade your soil so that water moves away from structures. Separate your irrigation valves so that shady areas and sunny areas are watered differently and appropriately. Think about where water goes when it rains hard before you start planting. The long game also applies to plant selection in a way we touched on earlier, but I want to revisit. When you select plants that are appropriately scaled for your space, that are suited to your climate and your soil and your sun exposure, those plants essentially take care of themselves once they are established. You are not constantly pruning them back because they got too big. You are not constantly nursing them because they are struggling in conditions they were never suited for. They just grow. They just do what plants do when they are happy, and your job becomes mostly enjoyment with occasional light maintenance. I want to be clear that none of this means your garden has to be sterile or boring or rigidly controlled. Some of the most beautiful gardens I have ever seen are a little wild. They have plants that have been allowed to find their natural form. They have spaces that feel relaxed and alive rather than manicured and stiff. The goal is not perfect control. The goal is a landscape that is healthy enough and well-designed enough that it mostly takes care of itself, and beautiful enough that you actually want to spend time in it. Think about use. Think about soil. Think about water. Think about scale. Think about maintenance before you need to do any maintenance. Make those decisions thoughtfully at the beginning, and the rest of it becomes so much more manageable, and honestly, so much more enjoyable. Here's the truth about beautiful yards. They are not about spending more money or working harder. Every single person I have met with a truly great landscape got there the same way. They stopped chasing the perfect look and started making smart decisions. Soil first. Right plants, right place. Water less. Mulch always. Prune properly. Plan before you plant. And design for your life, not for a magazine. That is it. 8 tips. That is the whole game. If you found this useful, subscribe. Chip and I put out new videos every week and we would love to help you get there.